epilepsy don't include many points, nor does schizophrenia, but affective disorders certainly do have several points.
Oh, yeah, okay. So you haven't got a particular quote for that, but that's a chapter on that, of course.
Yes.
So, okay, give me just 1 minute and I'll be back.
No problem. Yeah.
I just want to make sure that Jenny makes me a cup of tea.
Of course, yes. So please say hello.
Say hello, Chris. Yeah. In a moment. Just pop that on.
Hi.
Hello,
How
Chris.
are you?
I'm good, thank you. Gosh, you've changed. You've got a big beard.
Yes. I'm compensating for what's lost on top.
Don't suggest that to Michael. It might not suit him. So everything good with you?
Very well, thank you. And with you, I hope.
Well done. We're super. Thank you very much. Lovely to see you.
Lovely seeing you too.
And don't forget the cup of tea.
So Vivek, are you ready to start?
Yeah.
I will start the live serve. We will wait for before everyone joins, and then we can start.
So you'll tell us when to get going. Yeah.
Yes, sir. We are live.
Shall I close the door, Jenny? I'll just close the door. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks. Yeah. Okay, there we go.
Shall we go, Vivek?
Sure, sir.
Okay.
So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Buddhi Clinic's Brain and Behavior Dialogue. We are very, very fortunate today to have one of the most eminent people in the brain and mind interface, Professor Micheal Trimble, who also happens to be my guru, join us. And he has had a most illustrious career. After doing medicine, he actually studied neuroanatomy formally before going off to train in medicine, neurology, and psychiatry. Mm-hmm. And he has spent time at various places, including with the very legendary Professor Norman Geschwind. Professor Trimble went on to follow Professor Elliot Slater, another extremely eminent individual, into the chair at Queen Square, and eventually he established the Raymond Way unit, where several of us have been privileged to train over the years and to learn under his tutelage to learn the brain behavior interface. So welcome, Professor Trimble. It's a great honor and a pleasure to have you here today. Prof, let me start by asking you about what made you choose neuropsychiatry when you were a young doctor, when it obviously wasn't a very popular or a hardly known specialty. And then what has persuaded you to become interested in neuroaesthetics, which is the subject of today's discussion thereafter?
Yes, yeah. The term neuropsychiatry is a problem and always was a problem. But in Europe, there were a lot of people who called themselves neuropsychiatrists. but it was not clear what they were particularly interested in, but it was more to do with psychosomatic medicine, I think, really, not the neuropsychiatry that began to evolve a little bit out of psychoanalysis in some ways, because Freud, remember, was a neurologist. And in many ways was a neurologist to the end, in the sense he wanted to work out the mind-brain problem, but was unable to do that. But remember, his early models had models of neurons which were inhibitory and excitatory and whatever. So there was the word neuropsychiatry, but modern neuropsychiatry is different. A modern neuropsychiatry began to evolve really with, well, I would suggest, an understanding of the limbic system. And the understanding of the limbic system emerged particularly after the 1950s and 1960s. And the crucial findings, I believe, for neuropsychiatry were from the discovery clinically of the EEG. And the EEG was fundamental in identifying a form of epilepsy, which we used to call temporal lobe epilepsy. That's quite important, because now complex partial seizures, the temporal lobe, it was an anatomical localization. And the early work of people like Gibbs and others showed that there was a relationship between anterior temporal abnormalities and psychopathology. And that really altered the perspectives of a number of different things, which I'll come back to. But just to then go back, when the first neurology I did actually was as a medical student in Minnesota with one of the neurological gurus at the time. But I was always fascinated by neurology, and really, I think, was disappointed by neurology as it was when I first went to Queen Square as a junior neurologist. And somebody said to me, I was offered a place at the Maudsley Hospital, and somebody said to me, a very well-known neurologist, he said, if you go to the Maudsley, you'll never get back to Queen Square. What you need to do is study neurosurgery. So anyway, that wasn't helpful. So before that, neurology, though, you're quite right, in medical school, I thought neuroanatomy was, I taught it basically. I mean, I loved it and taught it. And to be a little bit blunt, I don't see how people can train in neurology, neuropsychiatry too, I would say, but neurology without having dissected a human brain. And the idea that you can do it all from waxwork models really is not possible. So I like neuroanatomy. I did my first degree, the bachelor's, the BSc in neuroanatomy. With the chief of the department was somebody who spent most of his time in Parliament, actually, as a minister, but his role at the university was with apes and an ape colony, and he did a lot of studies on the behaviour of apes in the zoo in London Zoo. And so I actually did neuroanatomy with somebody. We were interested in primate brains and how you altered behavior with giving hormones. And that led on to doing some analysis of brain sections and whatever. So I've always believed in neuroanatomy, and you know that my dictum about neuropsychiatry and understanding neuropsychiatry, you have to start with the brain. And if you're a neuropsychiatrist that doesn't start with the brain, then you will miss the essence of neuropsychiatry, which brings me on to the temporal lobes particularly. And the way that my interest in that continued with my relationship with people like Leonard Heimer, who for a number of years I did neuroanatomy demonstrations with him in America. And then, of course, when you were with me, we were interested in neuroimaging and forms of EEG analysis as well. And so we were very much related to that story. Now, where did temporal lobe epilepsy go? It took the people interested in schizophrenia away from the schizophrenogenic mother. You remember her? And it took a number of people, not a lot, but a number of people, started looking at the brains of schizophrenic patients, but not just seeing if they had large ventricles or that kind of thing, but actually looking at the temporal cortex, in particular the medial temporal cortex. And a number of analyses of anatomy emerged showing that in schizophrenia, the temporal lobe, particularly medial temporal lobe, hippocampus, was somehow abnormal. The problem in those days was that they would take half the brain and one half would go to one lab and other to the other lab. So they never picked up on laterality. But of course, it was Flor Henry who took us into laterality and the link to psychosis, particularly the left hemisphere, with the people following surgery who had temporal lobe lesions being more related to schizophrenia-like psychosis as opposed to bipolar or manic depressive psychosis. So that whole story of temporal lobe epilepsy led into a kernel for the development of neuropsychiatry. However, that was resisted by the neurologists, who still resist it today to some extent, although not all of them do. So when I first started with temporal lobe epilepsy and lecturing about it a lot, I'd get invited by the Americans to lecture on psychopathology in epilepsy. But they wanted me to talk about the problems with anti-epileptic drugs, barbiturates, phenytoin. They didn't want me to talk about temporal lobe epilepsy and the relationship to psychosis. But that, over the next 15, 20 years, became an accepted part of epileptology and actually was quite welcomed by the lay organizations that rejected it for a long time. So that's the beginning of my interest in neuroanatomy, and one which I still maintain today. And neuroimaging, of course, has altered that to some extent. We might talk about that later. Am I permitted to have a drink of my tea?
Of course, Prof. Please feel free. This is
get the next question. Okay.
This is like a fireside chat. So I thought I should introduce the audience to your books, which are for the lay audience, if I may say, or the wider audience, if I may say. And the first one is The Soul in the Brain, published by Johns Hopkins Press, for those who are interested. And some of my earlier questions will come from that book. You say that the idea of this book originated from the simple observation in the growing literature of the literary talents of people with epilepsy, from Dostoevsky on, that few poets are included. And I came to the conclusion that writing effective poetry is probably incompatible with certain disorders, schizophrenia being one, and seems highly restrained by epilepsy. In contrast, there seem to be legions of poets with what used to be called manic depressive illness. Could you please elaborate on these sentiments and the interface between the brain, mind, and literary creativity as you see it?
The relationship between neurological disorders, for a start, and creativity is always a sad one. It is very difficult. I know there are some people who've had strokes who have been able to continue composing or whatever, but generally the relationship and I think, didn't we not write up a patient with Parkinson's disease who became a poet after he was put on L-Dopa and won a prize in Italy, in Ireland or something? Anyway, but I've always been interested in poetry and biographies, and it seemed to me fairly clear that there were very few people who you could diagnose with schizophrenia who had, who were poets, really. And by that I mean in the canon, acknowledged poets. So there are many people who become psychotic and write poetry. And you could suggest that it's purely an infatuation with the Western cultural model of the development of art. But whatever, the development of art in the Western world did spread very wide and still is very wide. And we can come on to music perhaps a little later. But I struggled to find any poets that had schizophrenia. Now, there were a few, and they're in the book, and they're probably not known to many people. What happened is when you looked at their poetry, and some of them were very notable poets when they were very young, but when you looked at their poetry, it gradually began to deteriorate and to lose its form and its excitement, but also loss of rhythm as well, and a vacancy of the metaphor and ideas. And I think in the book, I mentioned about 4 or 5 poets who deteriorated quite dramatically as they moved into what eventually became an asylum life. Now, what you then noted was that there was a lot of people who were poets who became unwell, but largely interlinked with alcoholism. Remember, in the 19th century, the main drugs that are in use now were not in use then. There were some 20th century poets, of course, who were very reliant on psychoactive agents. But when you followed that line, it was the bipolar relationship which emerged. And I wasn't the first person to suggest that. Kay Jamieson wrote all about Byron, and she listed some people who I would have thought were not bipolar, frankly, but it didn't matter. And that all took not a turn later, but a question of looking at how many sculptors had schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, how many painters had bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, areas which I've not been able to enter simply because it's too much, there's too much to do, and it's somewhat difficult. However, it's when you look at musicians, and again, I think we discuss this quite a lot, it's the same issue. To be a musician, again in the canon, to be a musician and have schizophrenia seems to me impossible. And if you look at a score, a compositional score of any music, a Brahms score, a Beethoven score, Wagner in particular, if you look at the actual number, I just say notes that are written down that have to follow a train which goes on and on and on. Very different, by the way, from raga music. But to have that ability to cohere over a long period of time with a musical narrative, I thought was impossible. But the same story, manic depressive, bipolar musicians outweigh any schizophrenic musicians by far. I think with Dale Hesdorfer, we tried to find any composer in the canon with schizophrenia and came up, I think, with maybe 1 or 2 possible cases. So that link, soul in the brain, brings together poetry, brings together music, and what goes with poetry and music? Go back to the beginnings of European Western culture. And where do you end up? You end up in Athens. And the idea that there was an expression in German, it was called the Gesamtkunstwerk, the total work of art, the Gesamtkunstwerk. And that idea, which became popular in Germany in the 19th century, the idea of integrating aspects of the arts together. So if you integrate music and you integrate poetry, where do you find that in the Greek culture? In the theater. So what else do you have in the theater? In Greek times, you have dancing. And when you put together dancing and poetry and music, you have movement. And so the whole idea that the arts are somehow different in terms of the way they affect the brain, and hence us, emerges from the idea of the importance of movement in all our lives, but movement in those arts. And again, we can ask a bit more about what unites those arts. Of course, there were statues. That's true. And they didn't have a great part in the Greek theatre, but they obviously did it to some extent. So that was where then the neuroaesthetics became much more relevant. And as you know, I really have been most interested in opera, and why it is that, again, opera, which is running into a big problem at the moment, because not being able to get on into the theatres and whatever. Opera eventually became the high point of Western musical culture through the 19th and well into the 20th century. And it was opera that, again, you have to look and see which opera composers are schizophrenic. Not any. I mean, again, in the drug era of the 20th century, there are some strange composers, and there may well have been strange composers before. But again, it's the bipolar aspects of those composers that stand out.
So interestingly, with creativity, the association is more with bipolar disorder and probably substance abuse than it is schizophrenia or epilepsy.
Well, I didn't just put epilepsy into that story, but the link between epilepsy and temporal lobe and schizophrenia, of course, again, unites the fact that the number of composers, the number of poets with epilepsy, again, are very limited. Now, interesting fact, it's all in the book, that people with temporal lobe epilepsy, and you did a lot of work on this, bring together the other aspect of the Greek theatre, namely religion. And of course, the festivals of Dionysus, which is where the plays were put on, was a religious festival. And so the link between these art forms and religion, of course, becomes very prominent in the Renaissance in Europe, where the Renaissance, it was a birth of the Greek times, the rebirth of a certain culture. Again, the unification of music emerged, as opera emerged in the 17th century, out of religious music, although to some extent religious music emerged out of early opera. In other words, moving music from very early musical forms, which was the very early simple opera. Music then expanded in the church as well. So the religion aspect became important. And there was this link, which you researched as well as I did, on associations between intense religiosity and temporal lobe epilepsy.
I'd like to take you on to the hemispheric dominance story, Prof. Writing about the right hemisphere, you quote Cutting, who echoed Nietzsche's Ja sagen and said, life, it's about life. You mentioned the 7 L's of human life: language, laudation, lying, laughter, lacrimation, lyric, and love. And the 7 L's, you say, are quintessentially driven by the right hemisphere, which, when harnessed in creative harmony with functions of the left side of the brain, give rise to the death of dualism and the birth of a duet. Please tell us about right and left brain and about creativity.
I think the whole story is very interesting, well before I was involved. But the story again was due to the fact that the the left hemisphere went one way and the right hemisphere went another way. But it was the language story. Philosophers, but also neuroscientists, became obsessed with language. And language was purely syntactic, really. Semantics, the meaning of language, tended to get totally ignored. And of course, what happened is, in the great era of Broca and his discoveries in Paris in the 19th century, Broca identified a lesion in the brain, frontal brain, of patients who'd had strokes. And the story rapidly evolved that it was left anterior from a collection of brains, but the right hemisphere tended to be called the minor hemisphere, not the dominant hemisphere, fairly quickly. And it was dominant because it linked lesion on the left hemisphere, aphasic-like disturbances, and hemiparesis on the right. And you lost writing skills and you lost your dexterity, dexter, right-hand side. Now, the Hewlings-Jackson, who we both know, who was part of what really was the modern founder to me the modern neuropsychiatry founder, if I put it like that, resisted very much the idea that language could be only a feature of the left hemisphere. And of course it made sense that, I mean, you couldn't think that all that I am now doing can have evolved without me actually gesticulating, which requires more than one part of the brain. It also requires an aspect of language which was poorly studied, but was called prosody now. And again, that links you, by the way, to poetry. So if I talk a bit like this for an hour and a half, it won't be very interesting. And you have to bring some expression into your lectures, as you and I know. And that aspect, the emotional tone to language, then became more apparent when people started looking at abnormalities of the right hemisphere. And that didn't really come on till the Geschwind era, actually. I mean, Norman Geschwind was extremely important in this area because he took laterality very seriously and did a lot of sometimes slightly strange investigations about links between the immune system and lateral, but we needn't go there. But picking up the idea that the two hemispheres were involved with language, but in different ways, but were united, if you like, in harmony. John Cutting picked this up, wrote about it a lot, and I was a student at the Maudsley with John, and we discussed these various things. And there was a very small number of us who became champions for the right hemisphere. Now, Ian McGilchrist, I'm sure you may have read his book, or huge, very large book, is another champion of the right hemisphere. John Cutting felt the right hemisphere was involved in schizophrenia as well. And the temporal lobe story with temporal lobe epilepsy, of course, many people with temporal lobe epilepsy, which is intractable, develop a mirror focus on the other side. So you have bilateral abnormalities there. But Gilchrist, I think, firmly put the right hemisphere into neuroaesthetics, because he was, first of all, a philosopher before he did his psychiatry, and was able to unite philosophical thought over the eras with ideas of language, creativity, and actually all different cultures, emphasizing that the predominance of the way that humans used the propensity to use the world around them with more of a left hemisphere or right hemisphere predominance differed between the Baroque era, for example, with all of its structure and repetition and whatever, from the Romantic era, where you had, to go back to the Greek theatre, Dionysus as well as Apollo, and the unification of those two requiring two aspects of human nature, which unfortunately then became split in many people's minds. So people say, am I a right hemisphere person here? Well, actually, the brain, as you and I know, approaches the world holistically, and we welcome the world into us as the world welcomes us to go into it. But the balance between hemispheric activity differs between all of us, and it takes some people to be mathematicians and other people to be philosophers and other people to be neuropsychiatrists.
Thank you, Prof. That really is really interesting. Just a quick housekeeping announcement. We are both on Zoom and YouTube, and the questions on YouTube will be curated by Vivek. Also, I see a couple of raised hands. My request is please type in your question into the Q&A box. It's easier for us to deal with it there, but we certainly will, take questions towards the end. I'm now going to move to another book of Professor Trimble, Why Humans Like to Cry, which is a book I've greatly enjoyed, published by Oxford University Press. In it, Prof, you quote William James often, and that's one thing I'd like to know, why you quote William James so often. But you also talk about a Berlin archaeologist who could reliably weep when he was put in front of a piece of genuine Assyrian antiquity, so much so that it became a test. And you also mention in this book the cutaneous shiver of William James, which I think all of us would like to know more about. So I'd like you to comment on why William James. Could you tell us about the cutaneous shiver? And also, I think the concept of anything can be beautiful to a person and move them to tears. And in this case, it's Assyrian archaeology. Over to you.
Well, William James was really one of the first modern psychologists. And I first, came across William James in early training, but I got looking at his work in more detail after his book on the varieties of religious experiences. Again, I think if you said to anybody, who was William James, some people might say the brother of Henry James, but Henry James is, of course, much better known internationally than William James. But William James was interested in consciousness, again, a world now which has fallen into complete disrepute. But William James actually gave us the idea of the stream of consciousness. So those people who want to break what we think or what we speak, or even philosophically, these matters into little partitions. What does this word mean? What does, actually William James made the point that the one thing leads to another, but there's a continuous in our minds linking of all these factors. So he was very interested in that. Now, William James also wrote about aesthetics, but the varieties of religious experience, takes us back to the first book, were extremely interesting because the varieties, he said, and we took this as one of our models, Krish. If you want to study something and it's difficult, it's better to go to the extremes. So he said, you know, religion is extraordinarily important to every culture in the world. I suspect nearly, well, so many hundred, not 100% of people, but a large number of people. But studying it was very difficult. So he went to those with extreme religiosity, whether it was some poets, or whether it was well-known personalities, or whether it was saints or religious gurus or whatever. And he made the point that the human mind, brain, the brain is where we come in, but the human mind has a need for religious, whatever that might mean, some kind of religious and a transcendental idea. That again, it's a bit of a difficult point here, but so much of what we do is actually transcendental and difficult to tie down in any particular way. So praying is certainly transcendental, but actually listening to music is transcendental. You know, it's not there. Where is it? It transcends our mundane understanding of what things are. So that was William James. And then the issue of, the little, yeah, what makes you cry? That was very interesting. That was a quote from Proust, actually. And there's a lot of crying in Proust, but Proust isn't the main understanding for me of crying. The issue to do with crying, again, emerges from religious experiences. So I'm not sure if it's the same in the cultures that you have in India, but I suspect it is, that part of the ceremony involved tears. In the Western world, the lacrima Christi, the tears of Christ, became a huge Renaissance image, particularly in the Northern Renaissance, the tears of Christ. And in the earlier times, let's say the Middle Ages, or a bit before that, but in the Renaissance times, if you went to church and didn't cry, it was considered that there must be something missing, that you hadn't got all of the religious feelings needed to be in church. Again, you may comment whether it's the same where you are, but crying became part of then, and of course, grieving. And grieving is to do with loss, and loss is to do with loss of people and death and lamentation. And so you had the development in church music of lamentations, again, particularly in the Christian churches. I'm not too sure of the link with, for example, raga music and how that fits into the crying story. But we have discussed this a lot. But the idea of links between crying and certain musical forms and occasions became very relevant. So that thing about Proust was actually to do with reverence of the backdrop in architectural, well, in stones. Okay, this was a stone monument, I think, or whatever. But it is a worship of the past. And if you want to get rid of all of the past, all that the past means, whether we're talking about families or religious background or monuments or even the stones in the house where you live, which have been there for a long, if you want to get rid of all of that, you're missing something very important. And I think when this man looked at this artifact and burst out crying, then Marcel, who is the writer, well, sorry, the protagonist in the Proust novels, he said he knew that if this architectural expert burst out crying, it was genuine. It really was old. And so, but the reverence for ages past, much more important in the cultures in India, and is becoming lost in Western culture. Every decade, there is less and less in needing, or at least less and less wanting to have to need those elements from the past that are so important in terms of aesthetic resonance, aesthetic pleasure. I think that was that. Oh, and movement, which brings you back to crying, is an expression. It is related in the arts to poetry and to music. So those studies, we did some together, looking at an audience of people asking, did they cry to music? Did they cry to painting? Did they cry to sculpture? Music. And we did studies in India, Czechoslovakia, Japan, UK. Music, 80 to 90% of people cry to music. Poetry, not quite so many, but it was about 60 odd percent to music. And what do they have in common compared to sculpture and painting? They move. So movement is all a part of the story, because our life is movement and moving forward with expectations that very often don't get met. And there's one more aspect to the crying link to music, and that is the idea that it is acceptable to cry, men in particular, to cry in certain places. So you can cry in a religious setting. You can cry in a musical setting. So music leads people to cry. You can cry at the opera. It's okay. But otherwise, men aren't supposed to cry. That's changing a lot now, since many well-known actors and sports people go on the television and cry and whatever. So, things like the Olympics, everybody cries. The winner cries, the loser cries, the trainer cries, the mother cries, everybody cries. And it becomes fashionable. Okay.
Thank you, Prof. You talk about the importance of empathy. Indeed, you refer to Homo empatheticus, and you say the evolution of empathy arising from the theory of mind, mirror neurons, memory, our ability to foresee a future, and the neuroanatomical accompaniments to these gave us a brain that responds with compassion. We feel suffering. These have promoted behaviors of profound significance for the individual and driven by the development of culture. You also go on to quote Simon Baron-Cohen and say that empathy, like other behavioral traits, is not present to the same degree in everyone. Some people apparently possessing 0 degrees. How important is empathy for the aesthete or the aspiring aesthete? And what about other qualities like altruism?
Possibly one of the most important neuroanatomic, neuroaesthetic, psychological findings of the last, since the temporal lobes were discovered, was the discovery of mirror neurons. I think this is remarkably important. It's downplayed by a lot of people. And there is a problem that neuroimaging leads you sometimes in the wrong direction. So you know how many times you can look at the neuroimaging findings of people with, let's say, schizophrenia, and surely that bit of the brain isn't involved. Is that bit of the brain? And so it doesn't work. But the idea that there is a circuit or circuits within the brain that relate to identification with the other, seeing the facial expression of another. And facial expressions of emotion. So at first, as you know, the mirror neurons were picked up in monkeys who, when they had to pick up a banana, various neurons would be activated. Then when they saw another monkey pick up a banana, the same neurons were activated. And then people went forward, and in the human studies, it's shown that some areas of the brain, like the insula, link up with emotional expressions of people you're looking at or whatever. So this is extraordinary because it leads you into an understanding of why we are able to have in English compassion. With passion. Compassion with another. Through a linkage, again, you have to put this in a metaphysical context. Although it's physical, it's a metaphysical idea that something to do with your facial expression, come back to that in a moment, does something within my brain mind that gives me a link to you. And then you have empathy, which is means in, pathy, which is the feeling. You have empathy, you have feeling in. So you have feeling with compassion and feeling in empathy. So the idea that somewhere along the development of Homo sapiens, in our primate ancestors, there was the development of mirror neurons, maybe for motor acts, very important for a chimpanzee, very important to have access to another chimpanzee's movements. But they don't have theory of mind. I mean, people have looked at this and it's not very, you could argue against it, but actually theory of mind must have come along for emotional reactions with the huge development of the expression of the human face. And which brings you into saying, what is it about the human face linked to empathy and compassion, which is exclusive to the human face amongst all living species and faces? And that is the title of the book, Why Humans Like to Cry. Humans are the only living species, Homo sapiens, that cry emotionally. And it brings you on to looking at the effects of tears down the cheeks in emotional expression and what that means. And tears are a signal from one person to another, often of some emotional feeling. Well, sorry, all is some emotional feeling, but one which has been ignored in terms of people writing about it, and people are ashamed to cry when it is so important emotionally. And so I think we know some of the lectures I've done, or with you may have done them. If you take pictures of people with and without tears, the addition of the tears to a picture makes the world of difference. And then just going back very quickly to where do you first begin to develop your tears? Well, actually, fairly soon after you come out of the womb, not immediately, by the way. And then there's a point about a few months into early babyhood when tears begin to mean something different to the mother. Tearing is pro-social. It brings with it a social binding, which lasts throughout life. And so when somebody cries, it can be for joy, by the way. You can have tears of joy. And I don't know if you were with us, Krish, but when we did the study of the lottery winners.
No, I wasn't around. No.
Right. Well, very quickly, we were asked by the lottery fund to say they really couldn't understand it. When they gave people $1 million, or pounds, they would burst out crying. And why? And it didn't look very good. People should be happy. Well, anyway, with Dale Hester, we did a study of this, and it was quite interesting. I think nearly everybody who won £1 million cried at some point, but it wasn't always when they were given the check. Most of them actually cried initially as when they told their dearest and nearest. But these were tears of joy, and we have to remember tears of joy. And have I got another couple of minutes to talk about tears of joy or tears?
Please feel free.
Well, this is a link to the neuroaesthetics, and I'm actually wondering if I might even get your audience to help with this. You know, we've done some studies along the way. When we were examining what artistic forms led people to cry, it was music and poetry. And very few people cried to sculpture or to paintings. But there was another art form which we looked at, and it was reading novels, as high as music. Now, what have music, poetry, and novels got together? Movement. They tell stories. They bring you into a narrative. And I'm now just beginning to follow this up. But it's interesting to know if this is a cultural variant, again, of the Western model of what the novel is. The Western novel didn't develop really till the 18th century. But in India, I've actually been talking to somebody about trying to, I didn't give your name or anything, but you have something called bibliotherapy. Have you heard of bibliotherapy?
I have, yes.
Well, and I've lost the expression, but she gave me an expression which was to do with Indian novels. And she said, she studied novels in India. She said, in India, there are so many really famous authors who never get their books translated and exported because they sell so many copy in India. And it led me up to thinking, again, if you're wondering about reading narratives, stories, as something which is emotionally very important for a lot of people, is that something which is culturally related to Homo sapiens, as music is? I mean, music, every human society has music, and it's based upon certain very limited structures. I mean, it varies culturally, but the octave is a fact of nature, and you can't get away from that. And how you split up the octave, you have the music and tears. But novels are rather different. So I was quite intrigued to know what an Indian population might look like on this spectrum of whether they read so much, which I gather they do, and it evokes emotion of tears. So that's something which is preoccupying me just at the present time. Anyway, that extension of the neuroaesthetic story. And one more thing, of course, one of the most read books in the world are religious ones.
In fact, we have a raise hands feature in Zoom, so we could ask everyone in the audience the question. If you cry when you read a novel, raise your hand.
Yes.
Just be curious to see how many hands go up. It's going up very rapidly, Prof.
Oh, I can't see it from here, but how many people? This is, Krish, I'm so delighted to be doing research with you again.
Online, as it were. So you had 28 raised hands, Prof, and you can add mine to that, so it's 29.
Okay.
So,
how many people do we have altogether, though?
About 100 on this platform.
Okay, all right.
I'm not able to see what's happening on YouTube. So.
Okay, all right. But you follow the line that again we're talking about narratives of our lives, whether through a musical form in certain settings or without that, or drama too. You know, the drama of plays. That's a bit more difficult, but often the drama of plays that lead people to cry are often very much more related to music as well, embedded within the story. Hence opera and that kind of thing.
We've got quite a few questions in the question section, Prof. So I'll just take a few of those. You probably remember Professor Shantala Hegde from NIMHANS. You went to her music lab.
Yes.
And she's asking, good evening, Professor Trimble. Such an interesting topic and talk. The common thread between poetry, music, dance, and even language, so to say, is rhythm. Interestingly, many neurological and neuropsychiatric conditions, we see arrhythmia. Your thoughts on this?
Well, rhythm, of course, is what I was referring to with the prosody. I mean, the prosody of our language links in to rhythm. And rhythm, of course, links in with music. And there's a very, very old debate about which came first in our development. You know, was our proto-human ancestor somebody who was musical at first and then lost the musicality as syntax became more and more restricted, or you know, which came first? It's a very long debate. But we know, let's say, that the French music is for the French language. German music, I'm talking, I suppose, about opera now, is for the German language. You know, English music is for the English language. And I'm sure you will say the same links to Indian music too. And so there's something very important about the link between language and music. But language, I tell you something extremely important. The difference between music and literature is repetition. So in particularly canonical music, but also any pop music, repetition. And it's the repetition of those musical phrases which capture an emotional expression. But with a novel, you don't have the repetition. In fact, if the thing is repeated 2 or 3 times, the same sentence, you'd give up. Poetry also has repetition, but actually it's the rhythm in poetry which is far greater. So the rhythm is vital to the whole thing. And I personally think, and I throw this out, people have forgotten the basal ganglia. So if there's any particularly neurologically related people in the audience, go back and think of the basal ganglia, because that's where habit and rhythm and gesture and all kinds of other things emerge. And of course, it's closely linked with language, propositional language.
Thank you, Prof. There's a question from Professor Vidyanand Jha, who is a professor of management, but he also writes poetry in an Indian language, Micheal. And he is asking, do you know about rasas in Indian aesthetics? And the question is that if your brain has been trained for thousands of years to react to a certain stimuli in a certain way, does it have a chance of being ingrained in the brain itself? So in other words, is there a cultural response to aesthetic stimuli?
Well, that's, yes, you see, so go back to music. Every culture has music and respond to music. And you can imagine the very first non-articulate proto-humans picking up 2 sticks and banging them together and making a rhythm. And then somebody starts to actually hum or make some sound to that. So it strikes me that we are all embedded within us all is the propensity to respond to music, and how that then evolves as a community event. So I think music is very relevant in that sense, that there are engrams, or there are structures within our brain that link to music. Now, also, what about language? Well, Chomsky, of course, made it very difficult for people when he came up with the his basis for language being the language efficient areas. Sorry, not areas of the brain, language efficient systems. I don't think he's ever identified them with any neuroanatomical structure. But he would argue that, again, there are aspects to the way that we approach the world which gives us an ability to understand language, whatever culture. You know, you can, all cultures, again, I'm quoting, I think, him, basically, but everything goes one way. You know, it's the English catchphrase was head of a newspaper reading dog bites man. You can understand that. If it said man bites dog, then you'd wonder, well, what on earth was going on? Things go in a certain direction. I think in all languages, you can only go forward, or you can go backward, but you can't, mix up your sentences to confuse things. And you have verbs and pronouns or whatever. So all languages seem to have a basic form within them. And I would think, and there are people who, of course, are romantic persuasion who would say this, that poetry came first. People like Rousseau would say that poetry came first in terms of early languages. Of course, nobody knows that, simply because it evolved out of rhythm and a need to communicate. And of course, it's easier to remember if you have rhythm. And if you have rhyming, I mean, how could Homer's texts be remembered for hundreds of years by people when there was no writing? So there was a very, very early engrammatic way, I think, that poetic diction and expression may be embedded within us. Does that answer the question?
I think it does. Prof. You have a question from two people, Sonali Matthew, who writes for The Hindu, and also my better half, Gayatri. Both ask, people cry at the movies. So what about crying at the movies?
Yes.
Is the explanation, does the same explanation hold good?
Yeah, we didn't study movies for the very simple reason that people cry at the movies because of the music. I know Bollywood has become extraordinarily popular now, but there was a very famous film called Silent Movie, which was done about 10 years ago. It was a sort of a remake. It was a parody of a silent movie, and it was a tearjerker. I'm sure a lot of people might have seen it, but it wasn't silent. There was music, and the weepy ending is done by the music. So we didn't deliberately look at the cinema, but the cinema knows how to make you cry. Goodness me. Also makes you know how to make you frightened as well. So.
We have two people asking a similar question. So I'm just trying to quote their names to recognize who they are. But I'm not able to find that. So they both want to know about altered states of consciousness and how altered states of consciousness relate to creative moments and outpourings of creativity, like poetry or the composition of music.
Yeah. This is very easy at one level and difficult at another level. Certainly, a lot of artists have used substances to enlighten them, putting them into a different state of consciousness, which they will claim is creative. And I think this, again, goes back to the story of musicians and poets in particular. And there are other people, of course, who say, well, I wouldn't have a drink of alcohol because it would confuse my mind. But actually, the majority of stories of links to substances comes from altering the mind alcohol, particularly until maybe the 20th century. Hashish was very popular in the late 19th century. But there are a number of people, well, composers, who suggest that some of their compositional skill or some of their themes emerged out of sleep and dreaming. Again, the famous one is Wagner. I just happen to know quite a lot about his works. He claims at the beginning of the famous ring cycle, the Rheingold, came to him when he was coming out of a sleep, and he heard the most important beginning of the Rheingold, which actually the themes run through the whole of the ring cycle. But there are other people who claimed creativity out of dreaming. I can't. The man who conceived the nuclear structure of the polygon, you'll probably tell me who it is, says he dreamt this chemical scheme and wrote it down and this kind of thing. So there are people who consider that somehow the altered states of consciousness lead you into a different, when you ask them what, if they say, well, a different world, then again, you're with this immediate problem. That's what I would call a transcendental explanation. And what is the meaning of transcendentalism? And just in case you're particularly interested in what I'm doing these days, Krish, I'm just finished a book on this very subject of love and death in opera, with a colleague of mine, Robert Letellier and Dale, who you know, and it's all to do with why in opera, and anybody who's seen popular opera, perhaps even once or twice, will wonder why the person dies at the end of the opera, sometimes with no understanding or no explanation. This is a fascinating issue, but it revolves around the whole issue of the transcendental nature of musical experiences. Why is it you cry when you see, in Traviata, when you see the end of it, when she dies of tuberculosis, actually. But why it's a big weepy, people cry. So that again is to do with the transcendental nature of those experiences. So people would claim, I think, that altered states of consciousness, why they go there, is because it leads them into another world. Now, I think what with the tantras with tantra with mantras, does that sound right?
Yeah.
And the whole area of meditation. What is it that links the lamentations of the early Christian church with the meditations of Buddhism, maybe, and other cultures? From a physiological perspective, they all go down to breathing. And breathing becomes, I say all of them, somebody may say, oh, this is nonsense because it's nothing to do with what my particular sect does. But when you listen to what people say they're doing, it's all to do with control of breathing. Now, you and I know that breathing and heart rate are linked together. And also, you and I know that our breathing and our heart rate actually link to external input, the entrainment that you get. So the entrainment you get from music comes from the rhythm. And the entrainment that you get from mantras is, again, it's a rhythm. So that link to breathing is extremely important in terms of many of these experiences which people will claim take me into a different world. The problem is, if you're a strict materialist, you have to ask, what is that other world? And I think this is, again, still a problem. understanding material transcendental experiences from a purely material perspective.
Thank you, Prof. And as you know, in India, many of us have very deep spiritual beliefs and ideas. So I think your comments will go down very well here. Jay Salpekar is a pediatric neuropsychiatrist in the Kennedy Krieger Institute. And he asks, could you please comment about synesthesia and how that relates to creativity on a neurologic basis?
Well, I have a problem here. You may do one of your hands up in a moment. How many people have synesthesia? I've met several people who claim to have synesthesia, but I don't think I've ever met anybody with what I understand to be synesthesia. So, but it is relevant neurologically, because if you, for example, well, let me just go back. What is synesthesia? Is this not when you hear a stimulus, you have a stimulus in one modality, let's say visual, accompanied by that in another modality? So every time I hear D flat, I see blue. Now that's what I understand synesthesia to be. But I think a lot of people say D flat major makes me think of blue, D flat minor makes me think of black. So, but I'm not sure they're talking about actually seeing the color at the immediate moment of the harmony of the music. That's what I would call synesthesia. Now, the idea that you can metaphorically link a color with good or bad, I mean, you know, red, green, well, green, that one time signified the devil, another time it signified, you know, some other mythological character, but red, black, all these things have important things for us. But I think synesthesia must be relevant, because at some point in the developing brain, we parcellated visual cortex, auditory cortex, or whatever. And it would seem unusual, actually, if you didn't have synesthetic experiences. But I would think that emerged when the system broke down. So you do get synesthesia with drugs. I mean, Aldous Huxley's Perceptions, for example. When LSD was used, and I think Huxley used psilocybin, but then you do get synesthesia because you're experiencing visual and auditory experiences. And in schizophrenia, of course, you get synesthesia. But in the normal brain, I think that breaking down of those categories would make it very difficult. But I'm sure it occurs, and I'm sure people write and talk about it. How many people, Krish, in your audience have synesthesia?
So we'll ask that question then. How many people have synesthesia, i.e. they perceive something from a different domain of sensation? Very few hands going up, Prof. Just two at the moment.
Yeah, I think it is. I think even the way I've described it a bit loosely is very rare, but I think it must be part of the creativity perspective. In fact, it is more common amongst poets. But I have no figures particularly, but actually it was Ramachandran who gave me that figure, that synesthesia was more common amongst poets. So.
He's got a huge following here, as you can imagine.
Well, you can say that I saw him just this week, or last week, and he's well and still as active as ever.
He usually comes here towards the end of the year, so I'm sure we'll all look forward to a lecture in Chennai as well.
Yes.
Jayendra is a filmmaker, and he asks, does sadness as an emotion stay in memory longer? If so, why? And there's a related question which will interest you, Prof. Kanti Mani, I'm sure he's a doctor, asks, does kindling explain mania or depression, or both?
Explain what? Mania and depression?
Or both.
Oh, right.
So the Skindling explained the mood changes and the question on whether depression stays longer in memory for a particular reason.
Yeah, the first is quite interesting. So feelings of sadness and sorrow and grief last longer than moments of happiness. Moments of happiness last, well, very briefly, really. Somebody tells a joke, you're happy, you laugh, you win the prize, the lottery. Yes, that lasts a while and it may well return. But feelings of sadness and grief last very, very much longer. And there's a lot of poets who have written about the sadness of actually being born. It was a sort of a Greek expression, that man was better never to have been born. And there's a lot of poets who've written about that. So it leads me into thinking, I don't want to go into it now, but there's a difference neuroanatomically between how the brain functions in states of grief from states of happiness. And so I think there is a huge difference. It's a great skill to make people laugh, and a very important part of life to make people laugh. But sadness is something that outlasts the moments of happiness. Partly because when the happiness goes, you get sad. I mean, that moment has gone. So.
Before I'll ask Vivek to sort of look at YouTube and if there are any questions from there, but I'm just going to ask you one or two from the intentional brain. Again, from John Hopkins Press. On melancholy in literature, you quote Shakespeare, lovers and madmen have such seething brains, such shaping fantasies that apprehend, more than cool reason ever comprehends. The lunatic, the lover, and the poet are of imagination all compact. Why is mood and melancholy such an important part of literary creativity?
I didn't, by the way, answer the issue to do with kindling, which I have no answer to it, because again, kindling is something that has been misunderstood. It's a neurophysiological concept based upon neurophysiological experiments of what happens when you stimulate certain regions of the brain. And actually, it's never been shown in the human brain. It's only been shown in animals, and particularly in rodents and whatever. So now the issue then of quoting Shakespeare, the issue of the creative brain. Well, what I was trying to get out there is that I hope there aren't. I have to be careful not to upset anybody here, but I think neurologists have got it all the wrong way around. They don't understand or follow their own brains, and I kind of use this expression of the way we greet the world and the way the world greets us, and the world is embodied in us. But it isn't that you have a stimulus followed by a thought followed by a response. Actually, you go out into the world with expectations of what is coming next. And so the intentional brain was really trying to put together the information which has been accumulating for several hundred years. Well, no, that's not right, but 200 or 300 years, but very, very prominent now as an area of research, that the brain is a predictive organ, and it greets the world in ways that you hope is going to be fulfilled moment by moment. And when those are not fulfilled, then there has to be some reconciliation in terms of feedback, corollary loops within the brain, looking at the predictive errors. And so the idea that the brain is a passive instrument whereby you have a stimulus and then the response. And because you've had a stimulus and response, when that happens enough, the tracks are laid down for you to behave automatically, doesn't fit what we do. We actually approach the world with the world embodied within us. and it's a world that we need to control. And so I wasn't quite sure about the comment about poet and the others all being of a mind, but the idea was really that Shakespeare was saying that there's a way of expression in the world which is not to do with science and mathematics. And I think one of the difficulties, Krish, that one has to acknowledge that although the Enlightenment, again, which was a European phenomenon, has made huge differences to the whole world, it also led us up some rather disastrous paths, particularly the lack of acknowledgement of the non-dominant right hemisphere in our activities, but also in terms of the way that science is said to be the solution to everything. And it does not have a solution to those transcendental experiences that I've so much emphasized.
Dr. Sunil Narayan, who's a professor of neurology, would like to know to what extent does the human intellect understand the brain and mind and the relationship between?
The human intellect, yes. There was a famous expression, wasn't it? If the brain was intelligent enough to understand itself, it wouldn't be able to understand itself, or something like that. I think again, brain imaging, Chris, you and I know has been wonderful. And what would Hewlings Jackson have said if you could have a scan of a brain to show you when somebody's thinking or something? But I think the big difficulty of that is that our understanding of the way the brain works is considered to be understood, and it clearly hasn't. And I don't know, it's the same in your newspapers as it is in ours. You know, somebody will say, well, there's a love, the love center in the brain has been discovered. This was a travesty of the work that our friend Zeki was doing with looking at empathy, really, and things like that. So there's a travesty there. And I think we have been misled by a neo-phrenology, and I'm not ashamed to call it that, of spots on the brain. And it's getting worse, because now people have realized that you can do an image of a brain and have lots of spots. And now you say, well, how are all those connected together? Oh, very interesting, and all the p-values that go with it. Yet I don't think it takes us really down the line of understanding things that are most important to us, consciousness, but also those fascinating and important artistic, transcendental, emotional experiences, which actually are the meat of our lives, hence the 5 L's of love and the rest of it that you quoted earlier on. I think I'm not in that book. In the book I'm writing at the moment, I think I just made this suggestion that a world without music would not be human.
So true, Prof. Shirin Maman, who works with autistic children, asks, are autistic children creative? Can they be creative? Or autistic people, can they be creative? Or are they simply copying something? Also to go with the mirror neurons and everything else we've talked about.
Yeah, of course, I know about autism, and I've seen a number of people with autistic problems. Krish, again, since I trained, and probably since you trained, autism has changed completely. When Lorna Wing and others laid down fairly clear ideas of what autism is or was, it's now changed to autistic spectrum disorder. And the idea that people with autism may or may not be creative in special ways, I can't answer. But I do know somewhere on my shelves, I don't want to turn around to pick it out now, but there's a book on mathematicians. I don't know if you know it, but it's to do, anyway. But the point is, it's a biography of mathematicians, from somebody who's a mathematician, but also a psychiatrist And they point out the autistic traits that appear to go with mathematicians as opposed to, like I was suggesting, musicians and other traits. And Simon Baron-Cohen has made quite a play of this perfectly well. And he's actually got a new book that's just come out, which has to do with the male brain. Well, that was the one before, but he was very to suggest that people with autism had male brains, which I found rather difficult to follow, really. But if he was saying they don't possess the female aspects to it, the femininity, which goes with the bicameral brain, then I've rather lost track of that. But it's an area that I haven't really studied.
As we come to the end, let me ask you an interesting question from the Q&A box. How is it that some people are more creative, most naturally, while many aren't that creative in a manifest manner? This is from Sridhar Ganesh.
In a what manner? In a
manifest manner.
Manifest manner.
So some people are obviously creative and some people are not.
Yeah.
They may be creative, but they don't really express it in an obvious way.
Yes, it brings you, I mean, it's not to do with intelligence, but obviously that was one line that people followed. You do need to have intelligence to be creative to a certain extent. But I think that people who've looked at creativity in a broader spectrum point to the multifactorial nature of it. Particularly, it begins with your genes, really, your parentage. A lot of musicians have music in the family. A lot of poets have poetic related backgrounds, whatever. But other people seem to come out of nowhere. I mean, some terribly famous composers, people like Brahms, for example, I mean, came out of the very poor background, and whereas others like Mozart clearly had everything given to him in his, not only the genes, but also I think you have to have a family who will help you along the way to let your creativity develop. And I think one of the problems that I was mentioning about what the Enlightenment did and has done is to remove creativity from educational enterprises. I don't know if it's the same with you in India. I suspect it isn't. But now teaching of music in schools is something which is becoming extremely limited because it's much more important. It is important to learn mathematics and computers, but the places where you can develop your creativity, I think, is becoming more limited in the Western world. But it probably is not the same in India.
I think in traditional schooling that sadly is true. Although families, definitely those who have the resources, try to encourage their children to engage in the creative passions.
Yeah.
You make a very interesting statement, Prof, in the intentional brain, that clinicians generally, but certainly those with an interest in the neurosciences, can be crudely divided into the classical and the romantic. The former tend to concern themselves more with the parts than the wholes. Reduction rather than richness. Aristotle rather than Plato. Do tell us, based on your very rich experience of over 4 decades in neuropsychiatry, why we need more Platos.
Right. That really comes back to where I was talking about the book on the right hand, looking at the right brain, the left brain, does bring that in. And I think that McGilchrist really refers to this, that the problem is the extinction of the right hemisphere's potential by the overriding dominance of the left hemisphere. The left hemisphere gives the orders and stops. This is McGilchrist, not me particularly, because it's a bit too partitioned, but the idea of limiting the expressions of the whole brain with the importance of the right hemisphere is being extinguished by the lack of interest in, well, the arts particularly, but also the great importance of the left hemisphere language as it is, but language without emotion. And so that really was, well, the Romantics were the people who opened up in the 19th century, particularly, the issue of freedom, the issue of the Gesamtkunstwerk, the development of the arts together, the huge explosion of poetry and music with a totally different flavor to, let's say, the Baroque era. And the Baroque era tended, as I said before, to deal more with cluttering up ideas in ways that were supposed to hang together and be repeated, and there were strict formulations in the music. In poetry, there were strict formulations in, let's say, sonnet structure and things like this. When you move on to the Romantic era, then things changed. And I personally believe the Romantic era is with us still, but there are great attempts to suppress the idea of freedom, particularly freedom of speech and expression. And I'm sure it's the same where you are, but now there are a number of people who say, oh, you shouldn't have that opera because it has something in it that might upset somebody, even though it was composed 150 years ago. So I think that's really what I was referring to. But we're moving, I think it's called the postmodern era, but it may be even after that, the postmodern era, that we've been through the era of structuralism and modernism and then postmodernism. And now who knows where we are. But I think whoever writes the book in 100 years' time will look back on us and think, my gosh, what on earth were we doing? What on earth were they doing?
Prof, I don't know if you realize 19 minutes have flown past. And,
okay, well, I'm very grateful to have been invited to present with you again, Krish. It's been a great pleasure.
It's been an honor, Prof, and a pleasure, and I am sure that every one of us has really enjoyed listening to you today. So I will leave them with the thought that they should go and pick up The Intentional Brain, Why Humans Like to Cry, and The Soul in the Brain, all of which we have discussed a bit today.
And I think they're all in paperback except the Intentional Brain. But the Intentional Brain is really about how the brain works and how really we've got it wrong over 2,000 years.
And we do await Love and Death in the Opera.
Well, yes, the next year. That's right, next year. Okay, right.
Thank you so much, Prof.
Okay, all right.
The Namaste has become an international symbol now, thanks to COVID. So I will say Namaste.
Oh, maybe we'll start doing that.
Yes, Prof.
Okay.